Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Stewart, and I'm here today with Tom Pickering and David McLean, all from the Winning Thinking team. Tom, as you probably all know, is a well-known business turnaround leader, and he's also worked in Silicon Valley. Along the way, he's developed this Winning Thinking program, which is an extremely effective methodology that moves business leaders to taking new action and achieving sustainable success. David is a former Royal Marine and senior psychotherapist who consults to major corporations and is an expert in managing fear in adverse situations. We have a very interesting and extremely important topic today. It's called Getting UK Tech Startups Back to Health. And obviously this is a vital subject right now. Tom will lead our discussion, and he will start by introducing our guests, Richard Blakesley, Robert Horton, and David Allen. Over to you, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And thanks to the guests for joining us and the participants. So we've got an interesting down-to-earth panel. We run this every Tuesday. To start off, Richard Blakesley is going to talk about the viability and his observations of viability of tech startups. He's got some experience and a tool to do that, which leads on to the valuation of some tech startups. Rob Horton is a guy who's at the sharp end of restructuring startups and got quite a lot of deal flow coming across his plate, and he'll talk about restructuring and some of the challenges in the tech startups and putting those back together and refinancing those, which directly relates to the challenge of funding tech startups. I'll talk a bit about the operational turnarounds of some tech startups, and Mr. David Allen, who's in Frimley with his palm trees in the background, will then give us all the good news about where he sees the opportunities are. So that's a brief introduction. If any of the attendees would like to join the panel, they're very welcome to contribute. This is an active panel, so we try to be as down to earth as possible to really give the attendees something really useful to take away. So over to you, Richard. Thank you very much for joining us. We've got about 5 minutes each, roughly. We'll try and wrap up about 1:30 or 1:40. So over to you, sir.
Very good. I've got the stopwatch running, so hopefully I will actually stay roughly within the 5 minutes time. Thanks for the introduction, Tom. I'm the CEO and founder of a business called Capital Pilot, which is the investability rating agency for startups and scale-ups. So what we've devised is a means of quantifying the process by which a company can measure its attractiveness to an investor. And that's particularly important in the current environment, because obviously in receiving investment, fundraising is even more difficult than it normally is in normal circumstances. And there's a plethora of measures announced by government, by regional authorities as well in some cases, around how to support elements of the startup community. But they all have some pieces which are common problems that restrict to some degree the amount and the degree to which support can be provided. And I want to talk a little bit about how you can actually evaluate an early stage business and how you deal with valuation, which is a specific issue as well. Now, the evaluation piece of all of this is, how do you select a company which ought to merit support from public sources, for example? Because it's typically a matter of personal judgment. You don't have data. Data is the first big problem. There is not sufficient data about most startups to provide something that looks like a standard credit report, which a bank might do about a business which is later stage and which has 3 years worth of historical financial records and so forth. So pulling together an amount of data that can be parsed in a particular way to generate a sensible and statistically relevant outcome is a big problem when evaluating startups. And that's why the Future Fund that was announced yesterday relies on existing investment professionals to select effectively those companies that should be deserving of that support. Now, alongside the data issue related to it is a fairness problem. So again, if you have sparse data to work on to make these evaluations, then how can you do that in a fair manner? And again, this is why that future fund has been focused at this point on later stage businesses that already have some measure of VC backing, because that's where you can get the validation from the market. Which creates an interesting moral hazard, because actually you're asking government to support businesses that already have supporters. So why aren't those supporters supporting? Interesting question. But at least there is a measure, a standardized measure, which can be described as fair, but does leave out, we think, at least 1/3 of the companies in the particular target audience that we're looking at. Now, of course, you can get by the data problem and you can get by the fairness problem with human effort. And if you put loads and loads of human effort into analyzing in depth lots and lots of companies, then you can get to a decent point. You can do the same thing that an angel investor or a VC does in looking at every single investee potential company. But that's not scalable. And there's a big problem with the investment universe as a whole, which is scalability. No investor class is investing at the appropriate degree of scale to match the risks in the asset class, which is to say, you really should have a highly diversified portfolio. But as an investor, you can't have a diversified portfolio because you can't do enough work on enough companies to build a sufficiently diverse portfolio. And it's interesting to point out that there's a slight difference here between diversity and diversification. Both are kind of important. Diversification is just number. Diversity is breadth. So in addition to the data problem, in addition to the fairness problem, there's this scalability issue. And the scalability issue is the thing that government, we think, through the conversations we've been having directly and indirectly, is the principal problem that is restricting the support that can be provided to the earlier stage startups. Innovate UK put out a grant application, a de minimis grant application process a couple of weeks ago for 400 grants of £50,000 each, and they had, it seems, about 7,500 applicants, each of which needs 3 assessors. They're supposed to be announcing the outcomes of that on the 1st of May. Good luck. So how do we build processes that can be scalable, that can use data in the smartest way, that can build systems that replicate human behavior when evaluating these early stage businesses that have sparse data, and can use that replication of human experience to build fair and scalable models? It's an amazing problem. If fixable, it can completely transform the entire early stage investment marketplace, which might not be a bad thing. Back to you, Tom.
Thanks, Richard. So on that point, in terms of the specific sort of criteria that are jumping out at you, which are the ones that differentiate a investable startup versus a non-investable one at the moment, in your experience?
There are a number of different features, and we would put them into 4 categories. There's the attractiveness of the marketplace that the company is approaching.
Yeah.
There's the cleverness and the differentiation of the business model which is being deployed into that marketplace. Scalability, is this something that can be big over time as a business?
Yeah.
And then most importantly, executability. And this is the really tough one, because you can come at those first 3 with some sort of a data model. But when it comes to executability, which is down to team, you need to get beyond, has this team got domain expertise? Has this team got startup experience? And you've got to get more into behavior. So there's a behavioral assessment piece to what we're doing, and which we think is vitally important. And again, it's about codifying the thing that most investors do, which is to go down the pub, if you like, virtually or actually, with that particular team and see if they're the sorts of people you feel like hanging out with, which tends to be so much part of the process in early stage investment currently.
Yeah. And how does that, I mean, you loosely referred to, I think, the valuation being largely defined by current investors. Is that right? Or how do your 4 criteria actually convert to pound notes for someone like Rob to go back to the market and say, look, this is what it's worth?
It's a really tricky thing. The only thing you can use is comparables. and comparables for early stage are very broad brush. So a company that is at this stage of development in that sector looking to raise this amount of money is probably worth between X and Y.
Yeah.
So,
Based on
and actually it doesn't matter very much at the very early stages, frankly.
Yeah.
It's more about getting the funds in at a reasonable valuation so you don't get over diluted as a founder, because that takes away all your incentive to work hard,
Yeah.
in a way which gets everybody a piece of the action as part of, hopefully, a strong growth proposition.
Great. Well, that's a great kickoff. Thanks for that, Richard. So over to you, Rob. What are your experiences currently?
Well, Tom, thanks very much. Richard, that was really interesting. Thank you. And I was interested to hear a bit about what you guys do also. And we have similar issues when we're looking at, we tend to get involved in restructuring situations a little bit beyond startup, plainly because you wouldn't expect a startup to fall into restructuring immediately. So it might be a situation where they may have been through the sort of usual friends and family sort of raise, and then they may have been to an angel investor or a fund. And then sooner or later they'll get to a stage where they're running out of cash and things are looking a bit tight. My general experience of these things is three things actually are key in trying to get a successful outcome, and they echo to some extent what Richard was saying. So those three things are the quality of the management to start with. I think you have to have management that you can rely on to be straightforward and honest and provide information that you need. Data is key also. So we need to understand a good deal about the business and be able to rely on, particularly for tech businesses, we need to know what the intellectual property is, what steps have been taken to protect it. You know, for example, whether there are development and management agreements in place. And so we can clearly see, for example, for a tech company that maybe a software business, who owns the source code, and who owns the rights over the software that's been developed from that source code. And then after that, really, it's very, very important from our point of view that the process is a high quality process for a number of reasons. Firstly, the director's duties to the company are to some extent aligned with an advisor who is advising the company, and we're regulated, my firm, by the Institute of Chartered Accountants. I'm an insolvency practitioner also. So we have to act in a similar way to the directors to a great extent to avoid conflicts of interest, for example, and to try and act in the best interests of the company and of all of its creditors when it's in distress. So perhaps it might be helpful if I just set out the sort of protocol that we adopt when we're addressing sort of these sorts of businesses, and then hopefully the attendees can understand a bit about how we go about things. So one of the first things to do, I think, is to try and get some sort of valuation so you can benchmark what you're looking for in terms of either being able to refinance the situation, and if not possible to refinance it, at least you've got a benchmarking valuation in the event that you have to go through a process to either sell the company or potentially sell the business and assets if a going concern outcome or a financial operational restructuring isn't available. And that'll depend on predominantly the availability of cash is the main driver for that in small startups. You've then got to be able to collect sufficient information and data to put together a meaningful business information memorandum. So therefore you have to know about NDAs and the like. And then really this is usually the hardest part, is working with management to put together, as full a list as possible of potential investors and potential parties who might otherwise be interested in the business and assets. Because there's a very real concern with the founders that they're going to get very heavily diluted out, or if not taken out altogether. So it's a big leap of faith on their part to put themselves into your hands and to really give you sufficient information on potential interested parties and other investors. And we have our own panels, obviously, of people who will look at these sorts of businesses. But it's very hard if somebody's set up a business, run it for a couple of years, and then it's having to sort of take a leap of faith to let go. So you need to engage some fairly soft skills to maintain the confidence of the management as well, and to maintain trust and goodwill. Very, very difficult to do a successful restructuring, in the teeth of lack of trust and erosion of goodwill between the advisors and the management. It makes it practically impossible. I think then inevitably one's going to need some input from solicitors somewhere along the line, just to make sure that you understand the construction and the of the documents underlying the intellectual property and the company's constitution, and so you can advise yourselves and advise the board what actually is possible and what can be done under the company's constitution. So the starting point would be to aim always to try and get a refinancing and a restructuring such that the company continues under existing management. But sometimes that isn't possible, and then really it's a question of trying to recover as much value as possible for the company's creditors, and that really means then going into as full a process as possible to market the business and assets of the company in an open and transparent way, which gives the best hope possible of obtaining a decent value for the for what's already been done. Just wanted to quickly come back, if I may, on one of Richard's points on valuation. You're absolutely right. Sort of benchmarking, like market value methods, is fine. We quite often just look at a straightforward cost method as well, just to try and get a benchmark of what's actually been the cash cost of developing this product to date, because it gives you a sense of the financial commitment that's been committed to develop the technology. Hopefully that's sufficient from me for now, Tom. Anything else you need?
Fantastic. Yeah, that's really pragmatic summary. Thanks, Rob.
Right,
just a couple of questions on that. In terms of, you talked about source code, and one of the things in a turnaround situation is the snapshot of what the assets are worth. So if you're looking at some of the digital assets that are, assuming there is IP and what have you, how do you put a number on those?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Tom, and it's been amplified very recently. There was a case, I think, in the High Court last year, where another insolvency practitioner was engaged to deal with a company which ran a couple of digital television slots and had no real sense of the value of those slots. So we went off to one of the standard firms of valuers and then spectacularly undersold the asset back to the directors. And this is the point. He ended up the wrong side of I think an £850,000 judgment against him, plus costs from the High Court for underselling the assets. So it's really important to when you're looking at the valuation to make sure you engage people who've got sector specificity in whatever the technology is, and understands therefore what the value is likely to be. Yeah. So you can't just go to sort of the bog standard auctioneer and valuer for technology assets, because they won't understand the value in the asset. Yeah. And it won't protect you as an advisor or as an office holder if you then proceed on that basis, because plainly it's not that would not be acceptable.
Yeah, and that's a brilliant example of some of the pitfalls for directors, Rob, isn't it, in terms of how these processes can unwind very badly for the professional advisors and the directors if you get that wrong.
Yeah, it can, and you also need to be. I mean, there was another case last year involving where just managing conflicts, because there's the obvious conflicts, as I said, between the founders and potentially letting go of the reins, and whether as an advisor on a restructuring, whether you should then take an appointment as an administrator, and so really there are always conflicts in business. I think it's unavoidable, but the message that's coming back loud and clear from the courts when this has been tested, and there's been very, very vigorous judgments handed down, and quite scary ones. But the point is, you have to put systems in place to manage the conflicts, and whether that's inviting another practitioner aboard to deal with certain aspects that would generate a conflict, or allowing, let's say the firm of accountants or the advisors who did the valuation also to advise on which of the interested parties are most advantageous. You need to be able to let go of something so you can manage those conflicts potentially, and that's not always easy to do.
No, exactly. So there's a whole lot of company law around that, isn't it? I mean, just very briefly, Rob, in terms of the source of funds or people on your panel, what are they? Angel investors, or are they institutional investors? Are they Chinese investors? What, in a nutshell, really briefly, what sort of people are they?
No Chinese and no Russians at the moment. Tend to be angel investors, and through I've been doing this for my sins for about 30 odd years. So one picks up a constituency of followers, and a lot of those are in the investor space.
Yeah.
So we do put together a database of potential investors.
Yeah.
But also it's important to interrogate the directors properly, and potentially also the company's advisors, to make sure that you're not missing a trick, because quite often we have a company at the moment, for example, where we know they've already been speaking to two of the main civil engineering companies, potentially have an interest in acquiring the asset.
Yeah.
So it's really important. And there's also best practice guidance that we have as well, in terms of exposing opportunities as widely as possible to the market.
Yeah.
Because it's the best way to preserve value, Tom, plainly.
Yeah. Fantastic, Rob. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. So,
You're welcome.
a brief update from myself from the operational turnaround perspective. I think this is a bit like a bad hangover after an office party. I don't know if anybody has had that experience. I guess maybe it's just me. I think it's a situation where things are getting challenged on many fronts, morally, technically, investors, from every different angle. I think there's also quite an interesting challenge in terms of some of the tech startups actually undermining market valuations as well. So we've got businesses like HSBC, traditional bank, axing a lot of jobs when in fact a lot of the tech startups are making no money, and undermining market pricing, as well as giving away quite a lot of value. So the interesting thing about that from a company valuation perspective operationally, and part of the turnaround, is if companies are giving away their core business, their valuation, then it makes it very difficult for someone like myself to turn it around, because effectively giving anybody can give anything away free of charge at volume. That's really easy. Give me a job and pay me money to do that. But and a specific example of that, I think, is Starling Bank, which has got a great portfolio of products, but actually only makes their money out of the interest on the customers' deposits. So whilst they've got a very slick way of offering value, actually they give all that away and then through the back door just charge money on customers' deposits. So this is very, very interesting sort of territory. So I think there's a couple of specific turnarounds where, as well, there's one that we got involved with, an Israeli hub, where the proposition just didn't make sense. So even having changed the CEO, the proposition was this win-win mortgage solution, which is quite common in Israel, when in fact just didn't make any sense. And this business continued, burnt 4 million quid, got right to the end, and then actually didn't have a customer pipeline at all, even having changed the CEO. So this thinking predominated all the way through that. Another tech startup we got involved with, which was a medical tech startup, burnt 10 million quid over 10 years and still insisted they couldn't create a plan, which another interesting mantra. We created a plan, in 3 months we got the product to market, and then launched the next product in 6 months. So, and that business now is global. But it's these sorts of mantras. I think there's some other rather worrying things, because the tech startup scene also relies heavily on people like Google. About 30% of the funding goes through companies like Google around the marketing and what have you. And these guys, Amazon in particular, are pretty I wouldn't say abusing their market position, but they're certainly playing a very strong hand in rationalising their businesses and dropping a lot of customers which are totally reliant on the Amazon model for selling their products. And so that's really creating a massive threat, which is one of the reasons why Toys R Us went bust, because they were reliant on Amazon. So I think overall, it's a great time to shake up the tech startup scene. I'd like to see a lot of these businesses, frankly, triaged personally, because I think there's a limited amount of resource. My pragmatic view of the £1 billion which the government's come back on is virtually nothing. There's Revolut they just raised half £1 billion, 500 million, which is half of that in one shot just recently. So that's not going to go far. So I think it's a really interesting time to really sharpen one's pencil and to address some of these things. And but the challenge is actually the thinking catching up with this situation. So on a call, some very bright people are still talking about tech startup valuations. And when I talk about startups, some of these are quite mature, sort of 5 or 6 years in, holding up, which frankly can't make any sense. But this is the sort of thinking which people now need to challenge, and just identifying that type of thinking in terms of the stasis and the same behaviours. That's really the challenge, which is the sort of crux of the winning thinking capability. Thank goodness. So, but that's notwithstanding the complexities of what Richard's talked about, what Rob's talked about, all of the directors' responsibilities in terms of handling this stuff is really very difficult territory, which again is our background in terms of working with people like Rob. So we don't pretend to be insolvency practitioners. We don't pretend to be valuers, because as Rob said, people who try and fudge it or don't resolve the conflicts can get themselves in a real litigious mess. I think the other thing I'd add as well, this is COVID-19 thing, Rob. The trade into the detriments of creditors still leaves directors' liabilities absolutely wide open in terms of the subcategories of that. So that's my pragmatic view of tech startup scene. So I'd love to see the industry rationalise. I'd love to see businesses starting to make profits. I'd love to see the business models getting fixed, so we actually create a really substantial pipeline coming out of this. So that'd be my contribution. So David, over to you, my good man. Can you give us some good news? We've tried to paint the bleakest possible picture that we can, so that you can cheer us all up at the end and tell us where you think the opportunities might be.
Exactly. I have to say I'm a bit concerned about you lot, because I'm listening to all this. I'd say I'd get on a plane and go to America, but I can't. There's no planes. No, just joking. I've actually, despite my accent, I've been here 35 years and been part of the tech startup scene that whole time. Tom asked me, what do I think in terms of what's going to come next? What's the real issue? So I think there's a couple really important threads that go through who's going to do well and who's not. First of all, whatever you're doing as a startup needs to be compelling. So first and foremost, it's got to be compelling. It's got to be simple and easy for people to understand. And it's not what I call derivative technology. It's not something that does something that does something. Tom, I saw that giant fundraise by Revolut as well. And it's somewhat puzzling to me, because it's a debit card that anybody can get. That doesn't seem compelling to me, but it does to whoever put up the 500 million, that's for sure. But the second thing that's really important about whatever occurs is it's got to have to do with engagement. The difficulty with what we've had right now is that none of us have ever seen anything like this in our whole lives. The life has never been suspended, not only in this country, but in America and around the world, ever. I mean, we've never seen that. I was born 9 years after World War II, and when I was growing up, I mean, even in America, we had food rationing and the same things you have here. And the difficult thing is we've marched along a path for the last 65 years or 70 years, and it's all been good and up and increasing, and everything's been wonderful. But guess what? suddenly we've had a change, but that doesn't mean that it's going to change everything about where everything's going. You know, that doesn't mean that. So the first thing is it's got to be is compelling, and second, it's got to be engagement, and it's got to take into account the new normal, if you will. So the issue of social distancing is not going to change right away. You know, when we talk about people going back to work, and certainly they're talking about that, Donald Trump's talking about that constantly. All the 50 governors of the states in the U.S. are talking about it now. I think Boris, whoever he's got on the news conference this afternoon at 5 o'clock, will address that very thing. But there's a couple, you know, things that have popped out straight out to me. One, you've got Apple and Google doing this tracking app, and lots of people are saying, "Oh, I don't want to give up all my personal data. You know, I don't want anybody to know where I am." Well, the truth is they already know where you are. It's not a question, you know, if, you know, and that's been something that's gone on for quite a long time. You know, a little over 10 years ago when they had the series of bombings here, they actually were able to pick these guys up and pick them out fairly quickly, you know, shockingly quickly. And all that technology already exists. But the one thing that we have seen globally is that people are willing to trade off their rights for their security. So people are saying, well, actually, I'm not really interested in the government knowing everything about where I am, but I really would like to know if that guy over there has COVID-19. I really would. And in fact, I'd be willing to tell him if I have COVID-19. And so suddenly people are willing to do things that they haven't thought about doing before. Clearly, there's an issue of communication. So suddenly, pre-COVID-19, Zoom goes public at a shocking valuation. And I worked on the precursor to that technology 20 years ago, so know a lot about it. So they go to a shocking valuation, and in certainly 2 weeks' time, they've gone to a more shocking valuation because suddenly, instead of 100 million sessions, they have 400 million sessions at any given time, which is just absolutely amazing. And because they were pioneers of point-to-point conferencing, point to multi-point conferencing instead of point-to-point like Skype do and a lot of other people, because they perfected that pretty well. 99% of the time on a Zoom call, it's going to look good, feel good. You're not going to have jaggy communication. I mean, look at this call right here. We're using Zoom. It's using a lot of video, a lot of bandwidth, yet it works perfectly for the most part. So you've got things like that. And the difficulty is that people had multiple options for communicating. Well, I might run into you on the street. I might run into you at the club later. I might run into the pub. I might run into you in the conference room. I could call you. Now you can Zoom and you can Zoom. Like some friends of mine said the other night, shall we stay in and watch a movie, or shall we stay in and watch a movie? That's kind of the choices right now. So because the communication options have been limited, there's a whole bunch of opportunities for that. The second thing is that, or the next thing really, is that people are soon going to have to travel. And they're going to have to travel, and people who are doing things like serviced accommodation as opposed to hotels are going to completely change the landscape, because they can offer travelers social distancing within the confines of how they're traveling. Hotels are in very deep yogurt because, you know, you can't have 10 people, you know, in a lift going up and down because that doesn't work for the social distancing. So the people who are willing to make those changes can do really, really well. I was quite surprised. For 8 years here, I live in Surrey, and for 8 years I was a counselor here in Surrey, an elected counselor. And about 2.5 years ago, the government said, you know, see all these open office buildings that have been sitting vacant for the last 10 years? If you want, you can convert them to flats, and we'll do it just fine. Shockingly, the British real estate industry is not one that changes very quickly, generally. They, however, changed that on a dime, which was amazing. So people's demand and ability to consume things can change very quickly, more quickly than we realize. And that certainly affects, Rob, valuations, and Richard, how you were going to say, what is this worth and how is it going to be financed? The demand factor can change fairly quickly, particularly because if you look at some of the communication packages like Basecamp, all of the people who developed Ruby on Rails, which is one of the top computer development environments out there, not one of those people live in the same city or live in the same office. It's all across the web. So I think there's a bunch of those things, sort of at a 25,000 foot level. Those are my, quick hit, things that I think can make very big change. I'm encouraged by the UK's development startup environment because the UK today is the #1 environment globally for finance applications. Whatever it is, it exists here and probably was started here. So I think that there's a great amount of opportunity, and those are some of the, my own view on where the real opportunity exists for startups. So, Tom, is that sort of what you're looking for?
Yeah, it's great. Thank you very much, David. Yeah, it's very valuable. I think there's two comments I'd play back to you. I think when I saw the Zoom revaluation, that everybody, it's almost like it's another sort of bubble waiting to be burst there in terms of actually what have the tech investors learned. It seems like very much more of the same. I think the other thing compelling in terms of compelling proposition, when you look at fintech, which I agree UK is pretty strong on, actually most of them are just payment to payment businesses. They're not actually adding a whole lot of value, so they're probably not that compelling when you look at the valuations of them. There are some good ones, I think, that do some clever things, but I think that. But thanks very much, David. It's a great summary. So David McLean, David number 1 or David number 2. Any comments on the people side of this, David, and or any questions that we've had during this call?
Yeah, there is no questions yet so far. I have asked, however, we'll wait and see. But yeah, obviously this call's about tech, and it's interesting how often people come and get involved in it. Actually, at the beginning, Rob was talking about the rigours of working at home. And Richard obviously talking about the tech startup business and that aspect that you were talking about in terms of the team, the executability. Not heard that word for a while. Thanks for that. That's awesome. The human effort. How do you measure that aspect? How do you can measure? You can build systems to measure tech, but how do you measure people? And of course, we can use tech to measure people actually, which is a good way about it. A good thing about it. Sorry. How do we strengthen their ability? How do we strengthen their coping mechanisms? How do we strengthen their ability to make the correct decisions? And as we were talking about just before this call, the dopamine, the serotonin productions, the productivity levels, how do we do all that? And I don't have all the answers, but that's the questions that we need to be asking in my mind. But I think as David A was saying as well, though, and kind of trying to give a lighter aspect to all this, change is simple. It's just not an easy thing to do. But as a statement that I use very often. But when you're in the likes of what we're in at the moment, and again, just to quote you there, David, people's ability to change quickly is actually very, very good when they need to. So when we're in this position, when we need to change human nature, people can do it. So what can we do to help our staff? What can we do to help the people that we're working with, the businesses that we're working with, the leaders that we're working with, to understand this better so that they can then go forward and make the changes that they need to make succinctly, rationally, etc. and confidently, actually. So yes, I'm aware of the time, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
David, I think one important point there is because of this incredible situation we've got going on, the opportunity for failing ventures to fail quickly is magnificent. You can push the button right now and nobody's going to say, oh, you're a bad person, you didn't succeed. You're going to say, well, there was COVID and that was it.
Yeah, completely agree. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So David, I guess in a nutshell, what you're saying is the future looks like a compelling proposition with good customer engagement and sort of doing something sensible. I guess adding to that is also making money as well. I'd like to see businesses make money.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, it sounds novel in the tech startup world, but I think this is one of the big threats from China. It's the antithesis of the profitless growth models, which are utterly impossible to compete with. Yeah.
And bizarrely, early on in the tech business, nobody did it for the money.
Yeah.
We seem to forget that happiness and well-being links directly, not everyone forgets this, but it links directly to productivity. So this kind of old-fashioned, you know, should we really be working on people's well-being? Well, it's directly scientifically to profitability and productivity, in other words, creating money. So, yeah, absolutely.
I think that's also to do with relationships. It's easy to engage with someone who's smiling, who's not smiling as well, isn't it? And if there's no relationship, it tends to drive profits as well, David. So that's great. Really interesting discussion. Thanks very much, guys. Really interesting, varied contribution. So, Mike, over to you to sort of, what are the main points you draw from this fascinating discussion? I can't hear you, Mike. Have you?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Technology. Yeah, very, very interesting discussion. A lot of interesting points made there. I was really fascinated by the point that David Allen made about, you know, faced with these situations now, people are changing. There's this tremendous impetus to change. And then linking that to discussions about valuations of businesses, the centrality of teams. Seems to me we're in a space where we're trying to find new ways of working together, what David Allen described as the new normal. How are we going to work together going forward? And what's the prognosis for productivity improvement? It's one of the you know, productivity equals wealth at the end of the day. If you get your productivity going, you make a more valuable company, you make a more valuable community of investors and managers and employees. So we're going through an absolutely seismic shift that is being precipitated by COVID. And, you know, the last sort of shifts we had of these natures as humanity was probably after World War I and World War II. So this is a similar type of seismic shift, I think, as those occasions. But what's coming out of everybody this afternoon is this issue of, in terms of valuations from Richard, in terms of Rob and his restructuring of businesses, is the team and the focus and ability of that team to work together successfully is absolutely central. And I guess that's also something that's been central to all business for all time. But our landscape, our background is is changing dramatically, just the way David Allen's did this afternoon. Very good backdrop there. But thank you very much. I really, really enjoyed that.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, guys. Have a great day. Thanks for your contribution.
Okay, Tom, thanks.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Later.
Bye.